So you have things to talk about. Looking at your those messages you sent me on Facebook there. Let's take this bit by bit, and then the rest of the hour that we have left, we'll talk about other stuff. Okay. So your second book is coming out this summer, and you'd like to share evidence you've uncovered in regards to the identity of Jesus's twin brother. And for well, let's first talk about that, and then we'll go bit by bit here. So Jesus' twin brother. As soon as I saw that, I'm thinking, well, wait a minute. The son is basically what Jesus is, according to people like David Icke and Jordan Maxwell. And I'm thinking of my interview with George Kavaslis, where he talked about there is, in fact, a binary star in the solar system that's behind the sun that we see. And Alex Collier talked about this in his 1990s presentations. We can't see it because it orbits the sun at the same rate the Earth does, allegedly. And although Alex Collier claims you could see it if you were on Mars, but we'll make of that whatever you will. But the point is, Kavaslis said this second sun, what some people call Nibiru. I don't like that because that causes confusion with the Nibiru that Zechariah Sitchin talks about. But this second sun, it's a balance of the male energy. It's red dwarfish in nature, if you will. And well, did Jesus have a twin brother? Does that have anything to do with this balance of the male energy that also Enlil and Enki and Cain and Abel talks about? So, all right,
Actually, yeah, has to do with the planet X as well.
Okay, so you got the floor. Talk about this.
Okay. All right, well, my research was originally dealing with Christ, and it had to do with the moon actually causing an eclipse on the day he was crucified, just like Luke had mentioned, but other historians recorded this as well. The problem is that the Passover occurs on a full moon because of the way the lunar calendar is set up for the Israelites. All their major holidays fall on full moons. That's why when we had the 4 tetrarch moons, the 4 blood moons, they all just happen to mysteriously fall right on Jewish holidays. It's because their calendars are lunar, and all their holidays are aligned to the full moon, Passover included. So you can't have an eclipse that blocks the sun if you have a lunar eclipse that night, which they did. It was a red eclipse. So it's kind of embarrassing. They removed it from the Bible. And that piqued my interest because when I was in the Marine Corps, I came across a book called Our Mysterious Spaceship Moon. And that one was really intriguing because of the data this guy had, the evidence he had. Back then there was no internet, but you could track some of this evidence down. And what he showed was that there was more than enough evidence to prove the moon was artificial. How it got there, where it was from, who built it, he didn't know, but the evidence pointed to this thing being artificial. So then I started coming across the information of the Anunnaki when I started doing my research. And they are basically the Semitic word for the Hebrew word Elohim. And in the Bible, one of my first shocks was that the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament in Hebrew, never ever mentions God, the name God. It's just not there. The word God, it is not understood to be that at all, the Creator. It is always the Elohim. And I've heard so many teachings and preachings on the Elohim, and most people believe that it is simply a term that means plural, like deer. You have 1 deer or you have 10 deer. The problem is that if you have a buck in there, it's included with the deer. Elohim, however, it does have a singular. It has 2 different singulars, El being one of them, Eloah being another. So it's got singulars. They just seem to kind of push that evidence aside because it doesn't fit their neat little model of who God is. To them, God is this creator that created earth and everything else all in one day. Well, all in 6 days, 7 days. But that's not what the Hebrew writings speak of at all. They're very specific about who these beings are. They say these beings left the heavens, came down from the cosmos, from outer space, and came down to earth, and they needed a worker. So they modified an existing being. The verbiage is very exacting. They modified an existing creature to be more like them so he could take orders and do the work that they needed done to repair their damaged ship. There was some fascinating research done by this one individual who's he's a translator for the Vatican. And the Vatican had done some amazing work, but they could not use his work. They could not publish it because his name was on these works. And I'll bring up his name in a minute. But he was breaking down what the most ancient forms of spirit were. And the most ancient word for it is ruha. And when I was doing my research, I found out that whenever they found ruha in the Gospels, the guys who translated the Gospels, they didn't do a very good job. This is a whole other story, and I'll just kind of tap on it. There was a man, and there's a story called The Outlaw of God. And this guy translated the Bible into English. It was against the law to read the Bible in any language but Latin. So the priest actually had sort of a witch hunt, asking children to pray the Our Father, realizing these people had taught them how to do that, and they asked them, how did you learn this? Who taught you? And then they'd burn their parents at the stake for doing that. These priests were hunting a particular book down, and the guy who wrote it, he had taken the gospel basically and converted it over to English. I believe he'd done the entire Bible as well. At any rate, that was about the same time that King Henry was trying to get rid of his wife, Anna, from Spain, and marry some English girls and break away from Spain altogether and create a Bible. So in his haste to marry the other girl, he demanded that his scholars create a Bible in English. And they just didn't have the time to do it in the demands he made. So they actually took this guy's Bible and used it. So even though he was hunted down and executed, his Bible, what he wrote, became the King James Version. So it wasn't all these scholars that wrote it. If you really look at history and what they did, this is what happened. And this guy did the best he could. He had limited knowledge of the language. And so whenever he came across the word ruha, he only understood its one meaning, to be spirit. So where it says that someone was, it says, the poor in spirit shall inherit the earth. And that word is supposed to mean pride. And we still say prideful horse. You know, the horse has a lot of spirit. So one of the meanings of spirit, of ruha, is pride. And if it's used in that sentence, as a scholar you would understand, as a Hebrew scholar you would know that the meaning in that particular sentence was for pride. And we have words we use in our language, like fair. Fair, the county fair, her complexion was fair, the weather is fair, this is not fair. We understand it to mean different things when it's in a different sentence. We don't always apply it to the county fair every time we see this word. But they did, because they didn't know any better. And a lot of times it didn't make any sense. Like the woman who was bent over in the spirit, she touched the hem of his garment and she was healed. Well, she was bent over with rheumatism. Another translation of the word ruha is rheumatism. He didn't know this, so he just translated it as spirit. So you start getting into all kinds of problems when you do that. And the King James, they didn't fix that. And there are certain verbiages in there where they state this is the actual factual word of God, ineffable, and cannot be changed. It's perfect, so they don't try and change it. They are not going to question it, because that is part of their dogma, their doctrine. They won't question it. I had to question everything. The biggest thing I had to question was the whole Jesus died for our sins, we are sinners, and he came to redeem us, because that tied into all of the Savior God religions that existed before Christ. These Savior gods all came to save humanity from their sins. They were the Lamb of God. They were called the only Son of God. And they were all demigods, half God, half man, like Hercules. And these individuals came to redeem men because they were sinners. Christ did not come to do that. He came to set an example that a human being, a flesh and blood human being, could transform, sort of, the word would be more like metamorphosis, from a butterfly to a caterpillar, as a human form into a light body. And light body being this form that is immortal. It can touch objects. You could sit down at a table and have a meal. You could also walk through walls. You could teleport from one location to another, and you could change your appearance. And there's pretty much nothing you couldn't do. Are you familiar with the times where it says in the Bible that Jesus appeared to them, and anyway, that he sat with them and had meals with them, and that he was, he went through the wall, the door was closed, and he entered the room?
I believe I have heard that.
Yeah,
somewhere.
well, I once ran across this one priest who said that what they were seeing was a ghost, and if anybody had a camera and somebody took a picture, all you'd see is Peter, Paul, and Mary because Jesus was a ghost. He was obviously a ghost, but he just completely discounts the information that states he sat down and had a meal with them. Also, Thomas touched him, and he touched his wounds. He was real. He was solid. So they just kind of discount all that because they don't understand what this light body is. And to understand the light body, David Wilcock has done a lot of research on this, and his Ascensions Mystery book covers it very well. On one of my Facebook pages, the only one that I have that's not in my name, or not, how would I say, not titled as my name, is called The Acolyte's Quill. Acolyte being a student of forbidden knowledge, spelled ACOLYTE', and quill being like a feather pen you write with, QUILL. In there, I posted David Wilcock's, one of his latest releases from In the Desert, that conference they had out there, and he specifically goes into the prophecies dealing with what they call ascension, the light bodies, converting to the light bodies. And the reason I'm talking about all this stuff related to Christ is because ancients knew that in the future something was going to happen on Earth, and beings were going to sort of change, the humans were going to change and become a new race, not a new world order of the ages, a new human race. And he gets into some very amazing information that I wasn't aware of, that actually showed that the word, just as I showed you, ruha, can mean other things. It was understood that when they meant age, it could also, in that particular sentence, mean race. And they were all of the understanding that it meant a golden race. Now, the elite, the cabal, the Illuminati believe they are this golden race. And so they do all these atrocities, commit them. But they believe they are this golden race, but they're not. They don't fit any of the description of what the golden race will be like. Anyway, this golden race is activated by a charge of light that strikes the planet. David calls it a solar flash. And his research shows him that it's a blast from the sun. And it is, but it's not our sun. It's the central galactic sun. And when I came across that piece of information, I was really startled, because this guy named Seyfert, he's a scientist doing research on quasars. And I remember, for some reason, exactly what we covered in quasars in science. It was one sentence. It said, scientists do not understand how a quasar can have so much energy, can put out so much energy. And that was it. That's all. That was my complete education on quasars from high school. Well, a quasar is a sun the size of a galaxy, basically. Because when Seyfert started looking at these pictures with the new telescopes, he saw that at the edge of the glowing, almost like a disk, it wasn't quite perfectly round, it was more slightly disc-shaped, were these arms, the very edges, let's say the fingers of the arms of galaxies, protruding from the edges of these quasars. They were able to catch a quasar igniting, and what they saw were these plumes firing perpendicular to the plane of the rotation of the galaxy. They fired up and down as opposed to the circular flat rotation of it. And they were like plumes of light. And then there was a burst of energy from the center, the same burst that shot those plumes out. But this ring of light shot out across the galaxy and then overpowered the camera, where the camera couldn't see anything but light. And once it came back to being able to focus properly, it showed a new star, a very bright star, basically a star the size of a galaxy. So it is believed, theorized, that not all galaxies are these Seyfert galaxies, but I believe they all are these Seyfert galaxies. For sure, I know ours is. They've discovered these plumes coming from ours because the quasar in the center of our galaxy has ignited already. And the wave is headed toward Earth. And this is the wave, the same wave. Wilcock has researched the same wave. Jay Wiedner has researched. They saw it as a shock wave. And the Hopi called it the blue star, the Sasquatch, the blue star of creation. And when you see it, it'll appear as a blue star in the sky, and it'll start getting bigger and bigger until it takes up the entire sky, and then basically strikes the planet. The energy is supposed to be pure creator, if you could bottle it, like unconditional love, basically. And I've had an experience with getting hit with this energy. It's just quite amazing. You cannot turn it off. You feel so incredibly happy and giddy and just loved. And you can feel the energy of everyone around you. And I wasn't the only one that was activated. Others were as well, and I could feel it coming from them. And I thought, wow, is this what we're going to? Is this what's going to the Earth is going to be changing into? Because this was only a few months ago. And I thought, if everybody on the planet felt this way, you could never harm another human being. It just would not be possible. It's almost a telepathic type of sensation. Anyway, that was really fascinating. And lately, I've been coming across far more activations like that than I ever thought were possible. And the energy that's striking the planet is getting more intense and stronger, and more things are sort of activating, I guess would be a good word for it. Anyway, my research, once I got into that, I remember Christ saying that he wished the earth was ablaze, that there was a fire coming to earth, and he wished it was already ablaze. And in the ancients, they had many words for fire. And fire didn't necessarily mean what we see on a candle burning. It was something that gave off a light, like St. Elmo's fire. So they had something like 48 different references to fire, and not all of them were the fire that we understand, with things that gave off light, including the stars and the sun. So I came to understand that what Christ did, like Edgar Cayce said, he was an example for humanity. Not so much an example like Buddha, trying to be an enlightened being, or Mahatma Gandhi, but an example to show that a physical form could be transmuted into a light body. And he said we would. Paul actually goes into detail in this and says we'll be doing it in a fraction of a second, faster than time can be measured. The word is atomos, translated into the blinking of an eye. We will be transformed. But Christ did it in 3 days, and according to Wilcox research, there are documented cases of 160,000 individuals doing this already, but it took them 13 years. And he goes into the teachings of this individual who arrived, and he could do things like put his hands on a stone, put a hand on a stone, and then push into the stone and leave an imprint in the stone, and sort of make it liquid-like for an instant, kind of gel-like, and push into it and then leave the imprint. This guy had 6 fingers, and so does the Anunnaki. Anyway, there are images over in around Gibraltar. There's a stone where it said that Jesus put his foot on it and then pushed into the stone. And that one in particular, that little story, I know I'm jumping around a lot, but that one was from a special documentary that was created for DirecTV by Simka Djokovic. He's the guy who's doing the naked archaeology. And he started looking into the story of Jesus being in the boat, and it's assumed he's on the Lake of Galilee, and it's a storm, and the disciples become frightened, and Jesus calms the waves, and they get to shore, and there's an Archopolis there. There's a city of tombs, and there's the man in one of the tombs, and he's possessed by demons, and the demons beg him not to, cast him into hell or the abyss, and he releases them into a herd of swine that's nearby, and the swine then run off a cliff and drown in the water. Well, I don't know too many Jews that are raising swine around Palestine, especially not at that time. They just do not get near the animal, and it didn't make any sense to him either. So what he started looking at was another location, not that location, because 12 men in one of these small fishing boats, you'd barely be able to get them all in there. And then if Jesus was laying in the middle, anyone laying in the middle of that boat, down in the lower recess, in any storm, you'd be floating in water before they ever came and woke you up. You'd probably not be sleeping very well. And what he showed was that Jesus would have had to have been on a much larger ship, and possibly off the coast of Gibraltar. His uncle, Joseph of Arimathea, provided Rome with the majority of their tin, and he had ships, he had fleets. They were circumnavigating the globe at that time, both the Phoenicians and the Romans, and there's evidence of that in the Amazon. They found a Roman ship there, and so what they did, this was an archaeologist. Well, he wasn't an archaeologist; he was more of a treasure hunter, but he is an archaeologist. I can't remember his last name. Anyway, when they found this and reported it, they basically had him expedited out of the country, and then they had the military go in there and dredge the entire area, destroy all the evidence, because they didn't want to have to rewrite the books that it wasn't the Portuguese who discovered Brazil first. So the Romans were doing all this, and Jesus was on a much larger ship. So when they woke him up and he calmed the storm, they went into port. There are cities there of tombs, narcopolises, and there's thousands of tombs all up and down the cliffs. And they do raise pigs there. You know, you got Black Forest ham and stuff like that. Well, he figured that he must have had a reason to go there. And when he did some work and research behind it, and he thinks one of the lost 10 tribes was taken there, which would explain why Christ would have gone there. Also, some of the lost 10 tribes were in the Americas, and there's lots of evidence that Christ was in the Americas, having sailed here on those same ships. So he wasn't in Galilee every year, as we've been led to believe. The evidence just doesn't sustain it that he was just showing up at the temple every year. The evidence is very strong. He was there the first year, and then 3 years later he shows up again, because he was forced to pay a tax for tariff. It's a special kind of tax, the one where he tells Peter to go down to the water, get a fish, the fish will have a coin, bring the coin, and that'll pay the tax. It wasn't a tax just because you were alive or you had to pay it because you were a male. It was a special import tax. I mean, why would Christ have to pay an import tax on this? He had something to do with things that were being imported, like tin. Anyway, it's so spread out in so many directions and so much information. We've never been taught or told about what things were like back then, who he was, what he did. We're told he's a carpenter, a nagar. A nagar means craftsman, and much like the Masons have their craftsman codes and stuff like that, this particular type of craftsman would have dealt with silver and gold, because Joseph, the brother of Jesus, worked with silver and gold, and he would have had to have been taught by his father to do that. And one of the sons of Joseph, the father of Jesus. Also, in my research, I found out that it's possible he already had quite a few kids before he married Mary, and that work is by Joseph Lauren. It would explain all these. They say, aren't these his brothers and sisters? And when you start actually breaking down who they were, I was amazed to find out that most of the disciples were all related. You've got John and James, the two brothers of thunder. They were actually Jesus' nephews. They were the sons of Salome, who was the second oldest in the family. So it would have been James or Jacob the first, and then it would have been Salome, and her two sons were disciples of Jesus. And he had 3 sisters altogether and 4 brothers, and it was brother, sister, brother, sister, brother, sister, brother. The last brother being Judah, and they changed his name to Jude in the Gospels. Anyway, he had a brother named Joseph, and then he had one named Simon, I believe. So these were stepbrothers by the mother of these children, who was named Salome. And according to the Gospel of Mary, when Mary had to be given up for marriage because she had been in one of the temples, she was raised in a temple, and that particular Gospel mentions she was raised in a temple, but women are not allowed in the temple. The temple she was raised in is the temple of Asherah, the mother goddess. So these temples of the mother goddess were everywhere, but there was only one temple, for the main temple for the Jews, and that would have been in Jerusalem. And Solomon, King Solomon himself, built 200 of these temples. And it is not well known, and it's been removed from the Bible, that's why it's not well known, that there was a female aspect to the Creator. Yahweh was understood to be the masculine, and Shekinah was the feminine, also Asherah in the other language. So the priest didn't like that, because Asherah, as I said, there were 200 temples, and they only had one for Yahweh. But that is the kind of imbalance there is in the universe. You've got the huge galaxy, which is all pretty much feminine energy, all the suns, all the planets. They're all moving. They have life on them. They give life. That's all feminine energy. At the center, you have a consciousness, an intelligence. that pretty much gives life to the entire galaxy and holds everything in place. That would be the masculine energy. So it's really out of proportion, but that seems to be the mixture that operates best, I guess. And there's no problem between the creator, the feminine and the masculine energy. They work beautifully. It's just that the priest decided that they wanted to have a little more power, a little more say, and so they had to destroy pretty much anything that was feminine. And we've seen that for ages. The Catholic Church has gone overboard with the witch hunts they had and things like that. But that pretty much comes from the masculine, the males wanting to have total control and total say in what's going on and not have the women be allowed to say anything. It was because of this imbalance in power. Anyway, I mentioned that there was a connection between Christ and Planet X. This Planet X thing, when I first started studying it, it sounded interesting, but when I find the information in the Bible, it's a little it's like it was there the whole time. I just never really grasped it. In Jeremiah, when it says the Son of Righteousness, it's not talking about Jesus, but when they preach it and you're hearing the word Son of Righteousness, you think it's a title attributed to Christ. The word, if you look at it, it's spelled S-U-N, not S-O-N. So it's speaking about something that comes through and causes tremendous change, destruction, and destroys a tremendous amount of what was once evil. So that's called the Son of Righteousness. In the Cobran Bible, it's called the Destroyer. And following the work of Marshall Masters, he actually had some of the Cobran Bible reprinted because a lot of the information was unknown. But what he found out about the Cobran was that when Moses left Egypt, it was during this time, the last passing of this object, this Planet X thing. And from what I understand, theoretically, it's a brown dwarf. You mentioned that they believe that this object that's on the other side of the sun right now is a sort of brown dwarfish in nature. Brown dwarfs were first proposed in the mid-60s. They were theoretical at the time. And they proposed that if something was large enough to become a smoldering sun, it would have to be about 3 Jupiter sizes at least for it to start creating its internal combustion, as the theory goes. Not that I believe that's the way it works. Anyway, Jupiter is 318 Earth masses. This thing would have to be 900 Earth masses. And we're hearing people saying, oh, it's 7 times bigger than Earth. It's 8 times bigger than Earth. It's a lot bigger than Earth. The one that's 8 times bigger or 7 times bigger, that would be what's called Nibiru. Okay, that is not Planet X. Nibiru is just like the moon in a way, but the moon was constructed. Nibiru was actually taken from a solid sphere of rare alloy, and it was fashioned into a battle star, basically, because of the reptilian wars. They were damaged, heavily damaged in a battle. They had to take shelter around a brown dwarf to protect themselves from the radiation in space, because they didn't have their shields anymore, so they used the heliosphere of a brown dwarf. And then that brown dwarf got captured by our solar system, and there's evidence for that where Uranus was tilted at an angle from the pole, and then Neptune, they think, might have swapped out one of its moons or captured one of its moons, possibly losing its own, being Pluto, because of its orbit. And Pluto has long been theorized to have been pulled away from Neptune. They just don't know the operating mechanism for that. But it could easily have been this brown dwarf. What's fascinating is that the largest moon of Neptune is Titan, which orbits in the opposite direction of the planet's rotation.
I hate the rest of your bubble, but you mentioned Triton. Titan is Saturn's moon that they think
Triton?
Life. It's Triton that orbits Neptune.
Oh, I thought it was Titan. I better double check it. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Titan is Saturn's moon. Just thought I'd fill you out there to the listeners.
No, okay, thank you. No, it's okay. It's the only moon that orbits in the opposite direction of its planet's rotation, and the planets on this particular orbiting brown dwarf do rotate exactly the opposite of our solar system. Ours is counterclockwise, and that one is clockwise. So I better check that because I actually wrote that in my book, so I hope I didn't make a mistake. They can change it, though. Anyway, If it got captured into our solar system, as according to the legends of this object being captured, they would have been in trouble because they couldn't escape. They couldn't get away from that brown dwarf. Or they could stay around our sun, but it was more detrimental to them, this energy of this sun. And so they just basically stayed around the brown dwarf. This brown dwarf then began to orbit 2 other suns in our system. We have 2 suns in our system. And for those out there looking for, hard evidence, if you want to slap somebody with a book that's got the evidence in it, go to a library, a major university library. You're going to be looking for an encyclopedia, and it's called the Encyclopedia of Science and Invention. And it'll be in book 18. It'll be on page 2488 under space probes. And you're going to see a diagram there that shows that the Pioneer satellites, Pioneers 10 and 11, took observational views of 2 objects. They don't explain how they did it, so I'll explain it for you. They had the helium-3 telescopes on them, and these telescopes were looking for something in the direction of Orion that was pulling all our planets out of orbit. It was creating an elliptical orbit to all the planets that orbit the sun. When you look at a diagram of the planets in our solar system, the planets will all have a long elliptical orbit in the same direction. And that really shouldn't be normal. Something's pulling us in that direction, and what's pulling us in that direction is another sun. In that diagram, they call it a dead star, and they position it because of the 2 satellites. They went 180 degrees apart, so they got a binary vision look at it, and they estimated the furthest one to be 50 billion miles from our sun. And there was another one that they found, but they didn't know what it was. They labeled it as the 10th planet, and X being mysterious, not sure what it is, and also the Roman numeral for 10. That's why they used it, because Pluto was considered a planet at that time, so this would have been the 10th planet. 1983, when this was discovered, the encyclopedia was published in 87, so they identified it as the 10th planet. It was 4.7 billion miles outside, in our solar system, but away from the sun. Pluto is 3.6 billion, so it's just a little over 1 billion miles outside of our system, and that was back in 83. It is now well within our system, has remained in our system. It was sort of captured by our system, and that gets into a whole other sort of legend kind of thing, getting into Lilith, the stories of Lilith. Many are not familiar that when Eve was created, they also created several others. One of them was Tiamat, and another one was Lilith. And Adam was not too happy with Lilith. She wasn't that, domesticated. She was a little too, wanted things her way. Not in a bad way, but he just, she wasn't taking his orders half the time. So he wanted a more docile individual, and they created Eve. So Lilith was sort of shunned away. And a friend of mine, who has gone through she's an author as well, and has gone through the sort of dark night of the soul for over 10 years, has a very strong connection to Lilith. And she explained that this dark star that comes in would not be pushed away this time. Every time it came by before, it was pushed away. And the last 2 times it came by, like I said, the time before was the Exodus, and the time before that was the flood of Noah. When Jesus says it'll be as in the days of Noah, that's what he's talking about. The next passing of this star, which is now. Anyway, Lilith was always shunned. And this time, she wouldn't be. She would be accepted. And that is why that star is orbiting with our sun. They will eventually, that star will move above the sun. And when it does that, both of them will begin a sort of binary orbit, and we're going to see what looks something like a yin and yang in the sky. It'll be our sun, but you'll see the dark star and our sun, and it'll sort of be, that is the perfect sort of a union of masculine and feminine you were asking about. I believe that is a big part of what they believe will happen. Well, what we believe will happen. I had not heard too many other people speak on that particular object. The Planet X thing, I have seen it myself. I have photographed it. And interestingly, the day before my book was published, I was able to photograph it. So that was back a year ago, and that book is called Incredulous. And that is a book that contains the information about Christ and the evidence for him being who he was a Messiah Israel was waiting for. He is not a demigod. He was human, but he was also exactly who he said he was. He is the Messiah, and he has all the powers he did, all the stuff he did. That was all very real. The only thing is that he was not guilty. All of the other savior gods, they're all sort of sacrificial lambs. They died in place of you for your sins. And they sort of put Christ into that category when they created all the dogma in the church, but Christ was guilty. And if I can prove he was guilty, then that means that the whole innocent lamb led to slaughter thing goes right out the window, along with the dogma of the church. So let's look at that real quick. I don't want to give you the exact details of it because it'll sort of ruin the book for you. The book centers around it. When I was tasked with finding that information, I searched for 4 years before I uncovered it. And the Holy Spirit kept saying that he was guilty. I had to find the information. And I'm like, well, could you give me some clues? Because I don't get it. I was raised Roman Catholic, and I thought he was innocent. I thought he was the innocent lamb led to slaughter. So I couldn't understand what he had done to be crucified for. What he had done was committed sedition against the emperor. And sedition, I've thought it fascinating when I started seeing all the headlines that read sedition against President Trump. Because sedition is like when you have that actress who held up his, it was fake head, but it was Donald Trump's bloody head. That's sedition. It means you don't think this person should be running the things, and also you don't think very much of them. To say that, to imply that even, in Rome was punishable at crucifixion. There wasn't one particular account of an individual at a big party who wore something that was very similar, just happened to be by accident probably, but his outfit, whatever he was wearing, was very similar to that of the emperor's. So the emperor had him crucified for sedition. So if you said anything against the emperor that the emperor considered was not in favor of him, then that was sedition. And that's what Jesus was arrested for. And it was not a Jewish arrest. The Jews did not arrest him. That information I got from a very thick book written by a Supreme Court Justice of Israel. He sort of wanted to set the record straight. He was basically arguing, why would the Jews arrest Jesus and want to have him crucified, want him dead, and yet try to follow all the laws they're supposed to uphold? If they want to slander and execute him, why not? What would be so difficult about doing that? Yet they don't do that. They keep trying to follow protocols. And that made no sense in a people that were hell-bent on executing him. So when he started looking at the information, he saw that Jesus was arrested. He just didn't understand exactly why he was arrested. And he mentioned that Jesus was arrested by a tribune with his cohort, a Roman tribune with his cohort, because it was a Roman arrest for a crime against Caesar. The Roman legions were broken into 6,000 men. That's what the legion meant. These were broken into 10 smaller fractions called cohorts. The cohorts consisted of 600 men each, roughly, commanded by a tribune with 6 centurions. So the example I give so you can understand this, if you read in the Gospel of John, and it's only in the Gospel of John, if you read in the Gospel of John that Jesus was arrested by an officer and some soldiers, let's say you read that I was arrested, headlines tomorrow, Joseph Reyna, arrested by Marine Corps officer and Marines. Okay, well, you don't know how many there were, but couldn't have been too many. However, if the headline reads, Joseph Reyna was arrested last night by a Marine Corps colonel with 1 battalion of Marines, commanding a battalion of Marines, that's a lot of Marines. It's the number varies on a battalion, but 600 would be about the right amount. So when you see that, in our language, we don't understand what cohort meant to the Roman legions. We understand it to mean something like an entourage, just a group of people, your buddies. But back then it was an official part of the Roman army. So they arrested him. Then the Jews want him to hold him overnight, so the people who are there for the festival aren't offended and get upset. The zealots don't get upset. So he'll be in their care for the night, and then he'll be handed over in the morning. Meanwhile, they hold an emergency trial trying to pin something on him so that they can postpone his execution. Not because they want to save him particularly, they want to save themselves. They know there will be a rebellion if Jesus is executed by the zealots. They've already tried to make him king several times, and they just don't want that to happen right now while all these pilgrims are in Jerusalem. And a lot of them were there because they'd heard of all the miracles Jesus had performed. So they were just trying to save their own necks, basically. Okay, so back to why Jesus would have been guilty and what the crime could have been. When the Romans captured the Christians, when Nero wanted them hunted down, the crime, I found in my research that the Romans were actually quite just. Hollywood portrays them as very, very arrogant and pretty much doing whatever they want and making the laws, sort of bending them to fit whatever it is they're trying to accomplish, their goals. And yet that's not what history points out from the research I did, especially when you consider Paul, when he was arrested and they were going to flog him. And that was just that was just normal procedure. If you get arrested in some of these third world countries and they take you into the back room and work you over, they're not really necessarily being mean in a way. That's just standard procedure. That's what they're supposed to do. I mean, that's before they even start questioning you. So to take in these people and flog them, well, that was considered normal, I guess. Anyway, they arrested Paul, and they were going to flog him, and Paul questions, is this how you treat a Roman citizen? So what do you mean, you're a Roman citizen? And after that, everything changed. He was placed in a sort of different cell, and he was guarded. He was protected because they heard that some men had taken a vow that they were going to not eat anymore until they executed Paul. So he was actually given an escort, an armed escort, to take him from one city to another. In the Bible, you hear of centurions who were very high, spoken very well of by the Israelites. And the Israelites, Rome was sort of a conquering army that was, what would be the word? They were kind of like we are in Iraq, in other countries where we're not really part of that country, but we're occupying it. So Rome was occupying it, and I don't know too many people that have very nice things to say about American officers over there. But for these people to say very nice things about these Roman officers, that just doesn't fit what we've been told about them. Anyway, when you were arrested and you were going to be executed under Nero, the prisoners were asked repeatedly to repent and to simply claim that Nero was God, because to the Romans, the emperor was God, and the Christians couldn't do that, and that's why they were executed. And the crime against the emperor was that they were atheists. They did not believe the emperor was God. So Jesus said something that got him in trouble because it sort of implied that the emperor was not God. And he did it on purpose. He did it on purpose to undergo this crucifixion. And he was also not betrayed by Judas. None of the verbiage in there is the word betrayed. You cannot make it mean that word. But if you go see your English concordance and you look at the word that's in there in Greek, it will say betrayed, betray. And it doesn't mean that at all. But they have to make it work. They have to make it fit. Otherwise, the story doesn't make any sense because he was innocent. Why would they execute him if he wasn't betrayed? Judah had to arrest him because Judah was a priest of the Sanhedrin, and he'd been commissioned to locate Jesus, to locate the Messiah that was coming in. He was first assigned to John the Baptist. And there was a problem with him going and arresting him because you had to be arrested by a witness, not by a police officer. And to better have you understand how witnessing works, if I am going to be a witness against someone, I hear, well, just like now, you heard me mention the name of the moon of Neptune, so you corrected me, and you told me, no, this is the name of it. But if I'd have said, no, I think it's this name, I'd have just kept on going. Now you have to go and tell the authorities, hey, Joseph's giving the wrong information. Now can you kind of just help him out, straighten him out, make sure he knows what he's talking about? That's all that was. So a witness was someone who heard you say something related to the scriptures and then tried to stop you and tell you that's not correct, or this is blasphemy. And you continue doing it. Now they have an obligation. They have to report you to the authorities, the priest. And then the priest have to call you in, and there have to be two witnesses. And these witnesses have to have heard you say what you said on the same day, in the same place, same location. It's the same building, whatever that was. Both have to be located right there in front of you. When you said that, you have to have two witnesses that heard you say it at that time. It can't be somebody heard you on Saturday and somebody heard you on Sunday or the month later at a different location. It has to be two men who heard you say the exact same thing, same time of day. That's why during the trial, the two men's testimony about Jesus was considered false. Not because they were lying or trying to give false witness. Their testimonies didn't match up perfectly. The wording was different, and most likely they heard him say it at two different locations. So it had to be thrown out. And anyway, they basically couldn't find anything to pin on him. And because he wouldn't repent, they knew that in the morning when the shofar sounded, there was going to be a rebellion, a revolt. And there was the Zealots were going to try and take out the Romans. And they might succeed for a little bit, but a similar revolt had just happened about 6 years before Jesus was born, and the guy leading it was named Judas, or Judah. His rebellion was rather successful in one town, but there was a general, sort of a governor like Pilate there, and he had half the men that Pilate had at this particular setting. Pilate had he didn't have a legion, but he had two cohorts, and he had additional reserves, and most of them mercenaries. And this guy with two cohorts took back the town, crucified 2,000 of the rebels, and everyone in that city was turned into a slave as an example of what would happen to any other uprisings. So the priest, when he hears Jesus say, "You will know me when you see me coming in the clouds," he tears his vestment. That I've seen that done in movies, and it's a tradition for individual of Hebrew background, a Jew, to tear their garments when they hear of a death or of calamity or of war. They just tear a garment. So it's you're basically getting ready for something that's really bad is about to happen. And that would explain why the high priest did that. And the high priest was not supposed to tear the garments of the high priest. It was something he just did not desecrate. Anyway, I found that fascinating, how all that fit in. And also, most of us are old enough to remember when President Nixon was called up before Ford, and he was crying and basically asking for forgiveness. He had appointed Ford, so of course Ford was going to pardon him. But they never went to trial, and I found it fascinating that Nixon, before this, had been a Broadway actor who could cry tears on command, one of the few who could. And so we can't really say, well, Nixon was guilty because there was no trial to prove it, but I'm pretty sure he wasn't innocent. The thing is, he was asking to be pardoned. If he was innocent, he would have been acquitted of the charges. But if you're guilty, you need to be pardoned, just like the guys on death row want a pardon from the governor, or Billy the Kid in New Mexico wanted a pardon from the governor. So to be pardoned by Pilate meant Jesus was guilty, and he would be pardoning him. The problem was that because of what Jesus had said, if Pilate pardoned him, the Jews would take this information up to Tiberius, and it would not go well for Pilate, because Pilate was a member of a special group. It was an equestrian name to it, and they wore special rings. Joseph of Arimathea was also part of this group. He had that ring. So when people later, in the research I was doing, they were saying, well, there's no way Pilate would have handed over the body of this Jew to this other Jew, Joseph of Arimathea, who they hardly speak of. Well, Joseph of Arimathea, there's a lot of information on him. There's a name, I can't call it up right now, but it's a special title that the emperor himself gave to Joseph of Arimathea because he was providing tin from England to Rome for the making of bronze, and he was the largest supplier of this. So when you hear legends of Jesus walking at Glastonbury in England, well, his grandmother came from that island, and Arimathea means from the Highlands, Scotland. And that's why when you start getting into the mysteries of Rennes-le-Château, and you see that child who's in one of the, he's like being held up, he's a Christ child, but he's wearing one of those like kilts that the cloth that he's wearing has the pattern of one of the Scottish families. There's a reason for that. It has to do with the bloodline. And it was taken to Scotland. So it's really fascinating how everything's tied together. But they were on those islands. I mean, Jesus' grandmother was from there, and the mother of John the Baptist was from those islands as well. So everything's so intertwined, and so much more information, and they were just moving all over the world at that time. Like I said, they were circumnavigating the globe back then. That's why you find iron crossbows here that predate anything that could have ever been brought over. When the Spaniards got here to the Mound area, the area over by St. Louis, the priests of those particular tribes, they were all fair-skinned, and they had blue eyes and blonde hair. There were also 2 castles built here by the Templars. The Templars were already in the Americas long before Columbus was. That's why the Templar ships, he was using those to sail with. But when they built the cathedral, the one Rosslyn, and around one window you see a corn on the cob, basically imprinted all around the window in stone. 50 years before Columbus ever sailed, that's when that was completed. They knew about all that. They had been over here for a long time. So also found evidence that the Chinese were here about 4,000 years before. There's maps of the United States, both the North America, South America, the West Coast, and the East Coast. I mean, completely mapped out. And these maps were date back 4,000 years. Anyway, that's back when China was actually sailing the seas. They ended up stopping that in 1492. There's an article called "The Blue Comet," and of China, and that comet struck in the New Zealand area and destroyed most of all the major fleets of China. There were 4 fleets. One was never heard of again. One was off the coast of Oregon. It got pushed in 25 miles with the tidal wave that was caused by the impact in the ocean, left a 25-mile crater down at the bottom. And one fleet was thrown into the mountains of New Zealand, 400 feet high into the side of the mountains. And I'm sorry, 700 feet high, because the ones over in Australia, they were pushed into the side of the mountains 400 feet high from the tidal waves. So that pretty much ended China's exploration, and it was more political than just losing the fleets. They had kind of wanted to stop the importing of a lot of people were getting rich, so they didn't want to be getting rich. So they were losing control, and this was a good way to regain control of China. Anyway, in the Americas, that would explain a lot of the stuff that we're finding that just doesn't add up. The people were here long before that. So apparently Christ came to the Americas. They were circumnavigating the globe. They had their technologies were far more advanced than anything we were ever told they were. And Christ traveled a lot more than we were told he did. He apparently tried to go to the 10 tribes based on some of the evidence that I found, but he was also over in Persia. And there are so many books that I came across written about him being over in Persia. He left when he was 12 years old with his mother, and they ended up going by ship down to India. And there he studied in the temples that were in those locations, and he's called Isa there. And I just read the BBC did a documentary saying that they believed Jesus was actually a Persian named Isa, and he was. It's just that he left from Palestine to go there, and was called Isa over there. That was his nickname from Mary. She called him Isa, and he was known by that over there. Also, there's engravings on the side of castles and palaces that said that Saint Isa had, arrived there. It gives a date when he was there, and then he was, healed the king or whatever it was he did when he was over there. And he was known as a saint because he could heal people. And these The only thing that remains of these are pencil sketches and sometimes photographs, because right after they're discovered, they are chipped off the walls, literally, so that people will not ever go look for that information. And here's where you run into a problem, because there's a temple, not a temple, a tomb to this individual over there. It's in Kashmir. Mary always wanted to return to Kashmir after, at the end of her life. And she ended up getting buried there in Kashmir. And the tomb of her son is not far from there. And it's called Yusuf. That's the name they gave him for the prophet that he was. Anyway, it's known that he was not it predates the Islamic religion by 500 years. His tomb does. And Mary's tomb, it's kind of been destroyed, and they don't know where the body is. The stones that formed her tomb were all pushed off a hillside down to the bottom, and the British wanted that particular hill for a fort they were going to build, and the people were telling them, no, this is the tomb of Mother Mary. You can't have this hill. And they thought that was the most ridiculous thing they'd ever heard, so they went ahead and pushed the tomb over the side. And so if there's a tomb to her son, of her son, not far from there, that would mean Jesus survived the crucifixion or was never crucified and died over there. And this is where my research got really fascinating, because it was his identical twin brother who left with Mary and took her back to Persia and lived out the rest of his life in Persia. And that identical twin brother of Jesus was Judas Iscariot. And Judah, when he's at the tomb, when Jesus is being crucified, there are certain things that they said in different Gospels that Jesus is attributed as saying from the cross. One of them is, Mother, behold thy son. Son, behold thy mother. And they think they said it to John because it's in the Gospel of John. But John's mother, Salome, was there, the sister of Mary. She's mentioned in the list of women there. Also, one thing I want to point out in the list of women, they always mention Mary Magdalene first, even before his mother. And you do not do that. In their style of writing, you just did not do that unless that was the man's wife. You did not put a woman's name before his mother's name unless it was his wife. So there's so much evidence in the Gospels that Mary Magdalene was the wife of Jesus. The thing was that she did not have a child from Jesus. She was incredibly young. She was not as old as she's portrayed. She was in her teens. And Jesus was close to 40 at the time he was crucified, not 37. Anyway, she did not have a child. So after the crucifixion, she cannot re-wed anyone, and she cannot have an inheritance because she has no child. Whatever Jesus possessed, whatever he had, and like I said, he was a master, what they call a craftsman. So, and a craftsman of metal, gold and jewelry, and they were importing. So there was wealth there, but she had no access to it unless she had a child by him. There was a way to redeem the woman. She had to marry the next brother in line of this man, and that child would be called the child of the first brother. Are you familiar with those prophecies? Not prophecies, but actual laws. The Canaanites had it.
Yes, heard it here and there.
Yeah, Tamara, with Judah, she had to have a child with Judah and had to trick him because he didn't want to. But she could not be redeemed unless she had a child, and then that child would be called. And it was okay under the custom. You could actually have a child from the father himself if one of the brothers would not, marry her. So she did not violate any laws. She did not break any laws in doing that. Those were the laws for her to be redeemed. So Judah became her redeemer, and it doesn't mean they stayed together. It was just to have the child, and then this child, what everybody's all concerned about, this bloodline of his, and they're thinking it's coming directly from Jesus. It's actually from Judah. It is the same bloodline because they were identical twin brothers. It's just it was not the child of Jesus. And Judah, then they went with Mary, the mother of Jesus, back to Persia, and they went down the Silk Road. The Silk Road was in operation back then. So Judah, as far as the evidence for him being a twin brother, it was kind of sketchy and spread out all over the place, but it is found in the Gospels. Thomas, the disciple Thomas, that word has always troubled historians because Thomas is not a name. In those days, There were no Thomases. The word means twin. And in John it says Thomas, also called Didymus. And Didymus is the Greek version of twin, meaning double or a duplicate. So when you find the gospel, the one called the Gospel of Thomas, it actually says Thomas, Judas, Didymus. The only actual name in there is Judas. So that's actually the Gospel of Judas. There was no Thomas. Thomas is his nickname. He was called Thomas in Spanish. When we refer to one of my uncles they were twins, we'd call them El Cuate. And Cuate means twin. So it's common in some cultures to call a person by that nickname, the twin. And there was one thing that I came across, and it was really just kind of out there. At the very end of John, and John, of all the authors that wrote those Gospels, John has the most damning things to say about Judas. He was pilfering from the money box, things like that. Anyway, at the very end of John, I think it's chapter 22, when the disciples, it's after the crucifixion, and they're in the Sea of Galilee, and they're fishing, but they've caught nothing, and a stranger on the beach says to cast their net over the side, the right side, and they can't bring it aboard because of the fish, and they have to bring the boat close to shore. Peter realizes this has to be Jesus, so he jumps in the water and swims to shore. And then they're having some of the fish and talking. Peter asks Jesus, he says, Lord, who was it that betrayed you? And of all the disciples to be asking this, it shouldn't be Peter, because Peter, according to the Gospel of John, followed Jesus, followed the arresting party, and he saw the trials, and he was at the, he heard the rooster crow, and he denounced, or not denounced, but said he was not one of his followers because he feared he might be arrested as well. So Peter should not be asking, who betrayed you? If somebody betrayed you. And it wasn't a betrayal. The word itself cannot be translated betrayal. It means to hand over in the exact same way that Paul says, the information I've received, I'm handing over to you. Also I keep saying the Gospel of Paul, in the Acts, Paul recounts the resurrection, and he states very clearly, he says, if you do not believe that he raised physically from the grave, then you might as well just find another religion to follow, because everything hangs on that. And the reason he is so strict about that is because Paul, like I said, was a Roman citizen. He was not a Jew. As far as we know, he married into the Benjamite tribe, and he became a Jew, and because of his knowledge and understanding, he was in high standing with the court. And so when these believers were implying or saying that Jesus had raised from the dead, well, that smacked of all the Savior God religions, and that was very prominent in Tarshish, where Paul was from. So he didn't want these heretics getting away with what they were saying. And one of the first heretics that he actually has stoned to death, and remember, Paul was given his name by Jesus. Before he was known as the Apostle Paul, he was called Saul of Tarshish. And Saul took Stephen to the front gates, of course this was after, with the priest's blessing, and had him stoned to death. They didn't request permission from the governor. They didn't ask from the Romans, can we execute somebody? They didn't need it. All that part in the gospel, all that information is totally bogus. They could execute whoever they wanted to, and the Romans would not interfere if there was stoning. So they stoned Stephen at the gates. Stephen is the missing disciple. So if you've got the name of Thomas being Judas, that's two names for one person, you're missing somebody. And I believe that was Stephen. So if Paul martyred the very first disciple, they're going to have to kind of cover it up. And three of the guys who wrote these Gospels were followers of Paul. You've got John Mark, that's the Gospel of Mark. Then you've got Matthew. Now that is not Levi Matthew, the disciple who did write a Gospel. This is Matthew, a follower of Paul's. And then you've got Lucanus. He was a Greek physician who followed Paul. And these three individuals sort of rearranged, I guess, things so that Paul would not be in too bad a standing. And They don't make Judas look too good either. And then they sort of substitute Stephen, the missing disciple, with Thomas. So anything good Judas did, Thomas would be attributed with that, and anything that they saw as shady or questionable, that would be under Judas. And it's very evident that must be what they've done. So when you get into the Gospel of John, that one was written by someone who was actually there, by all accounts, because it varies from the other three. The other three are very similar. They all have very similar stories. It's just John appears to have been written by someone who was at the location. But historians are very clear on this. They say whoever wrote the Apocalypse, which we know was the Apostle John, could not have written this book. The language is different. The style is different. It's just two different authors altogether. And from my research, some believe it could have been Mary Magdalene who wrote it, and others believe it was Lazarus, and I kind of side with Lazarus being the one who wrote it. Because at the end of that gospel, it says, they say, and what about him? What about this disciple of yours, the one whom you love? That was Lazarus. There are many other of the Gospels, especially the ones that were not included in the canonized version. They describe Lazarus as being the disciple whom Jesus loved. And Lazarus at that time of crucifixion could not have been but about 10, possibly 11 years old. He would not have been 12 years old yet, because there are certain ceremonies that have to take place that don't quite it's just the way the things he does and the way he's treated, that you would know that those ceremonies didn't the ceremonies of becoming going into manhood. So he wasn't 12 years old yet. He would have been around 10. And anyway, I think it was Lazarus who wrote that particular gospel. It just makes more sense with someone who was there, but being young and not really understanding what was going on, it would make sense that it was a younger man, a younger adolescent. There's and this was brought up by Hal Lindsey. Hal Lindsey mentions that John runs to the tomb when they hear that Jesus has risen. But he gets to the tomb first because he's younger and he can run faster. Of course, Lazarus would have been younger and be able to run faster, but he doesn't enter the tomb. A young boy would not enter the tomb. He'd be kind of frightened to go into the tomb. And then Peter arrives, and Peter looks into the tomb, and he sees and he believes. And I've never quite understood what it was he saw, but Hal Lindsey goes into great detail on this, and he did some of the best research I've ever seen on it. He shows that when the burial procedure that they had, especially under surprise circumstances like this, he wasn't sick, they didn't know he was going to die, they have to embody sort of wrap the body in these little gauze-like bandages, like a mummy, much like when they were in Egypt. But they don't wrap the head, and they mix it in a shellac-like material. So it's sort of like wrapping a piñata. If you ever done it in school with a balloon, and you take the strips of newspaper and you stick them in the dough, that's actually basically flour that's been watered. Add some water to it, and it becomes pasty, and then you let it dry. So if this was applied to Jesus, 100 pounds of myrrh and incense is what's documented as being used. It would be a rock-solid cocoon shaped over the body with a small opening at the neck and no way of having gotten out of it. It wasn't broken. That's what he saw. He saw that it was empty, and that's why he believed that Jesus had risen, and not just risen as a human being, but something else more miraculous had happened. So I found that fascinating as well for that information. So much of the evidence pointed to the fact that Jesus did resurrect, and if he didn't have a twin brother, then his tomb is over in Kashmir. And like I was saying earlier, you can look for it, Jesus' tomb in Kashmir, and you'll find it right away, the information they've got on it. There's quite a few theories on that one, but I do believe it was his identical twin brother, Judah. And so how would he be his identical twin brother, and how would they be separated? When there was all this news going on about Judas' Gospel being discovered, I thought it was the book by Taylor Caldwell that referred to a gospel written by Judas. In the very beginnings of this book called I, Judas, Taylor Caldwell was asked, she was a very good author, she was asked to turn this gospel, this ancient gospel, into a novel. And at the very beginning, she speaks of this monk named Irenaeus, and he was in the Library of Alexandria when they burned it. And one of the parchments survived. It was the Gospel of Judas. So he smuggled it out. And knowing it would be hunted down by the Christians, he sort of kept a secret and would always it would be entrusted to someone who could be depended upon to carry it on to the rest of their life. So they passed it on to someone else. And in this fashion, it finally got to a Jewish family. But during the war, World War II, they were they fled the country and they left it behind. And it was discovered by a German officer. And he knew if he turned it in, it would be burned as the work of a Jew. So he kept it secret. And once the war was over, he returned it to the family. The family had it interpreted, what do you call it? The language written into something we could read. And it was written in Latin, it was written in Greek, and it was written in Aramaic. So that story was really fascinating and gave me aspects of Judas I never understood before or believed, but it doesn't go into him being the identical twin brother of Jesus. It just shows that he kind of vanishes at the end there. It doesn't say he hung himself. He just kind of drops off. And then someone else writes in after that saying that they're going to finish the story here, close it off, because Judas committed suicide. And in the Acts, Peter, when they elect somebody else, another disciple, they elect another disciple and they say, so that Judah can go where he must. He's going to Persia with his mother. So Judah has to leave. And if he stays there, they're going to hunt him down because they understood Jesus was the rightful king of Israel. And if he had an identical twin brother, then that brother would be the next king in line. They selected a man, and I believe it was Matthias, I'm not sure, but this guy was voted in at Pentecost 50 days after the resurrection. That's what Penta means, 50 days. Jesus supposedly was around for 40 days. Now, according to Paul, when he said he handed over all that information, he's talking about the resurrection, and he's saying, if you don't believe this, if you don't truly accept that he rose physically from the grave, then your faith is in vain. And then he starts mentioning the list of whom Jesus appeared to. He says that Jesus appeared to James first, and then he appeared to the 12. Okay, what does that mean? The 12. Those are the inner circle, the 12, original disciples of Jesus. And remember, Jesus was there for 40 days with the 12, and then 50 days, 10 days later, they elect another guy to be in there. So that guy could not be one of the 12 Judas is talking about. I'm sorry, Paul is talking about. Paul then says James, the 12, and then 500. And then he says, and finally he appeared to me. So I found that fascinating, that that piece of information had gotten past me, that he had appeared to the 12. And the most fascinating evidence of all came from the paintings of Leonardo da Vinci and another painter called Nicolas Poussin. Were you going to ask a question?
No, I wasn't, but just so you know, we kind of got to wrap this up in about, I can give you about 10 more minutes.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, so Leonardo da Vinci paints an identical twin sitting to the left of Jesus, and that's where Judah would have sat. Also to the right, this other investigator over from Italy discovered that the face of this being, the person they say that's a woman's face, that's not John. There is another beardless individual in the crowd. He's to the left of Jesus, but this one to the right. That face, if you take that face, make a photocopy of it, and place it over the Madonna of the Rocks, it's the exact same face of the Madonna of the Rocks. So it's a woman. And then to the right of her is a guy wearing light blue, and it appears he has a knife in his right hand. It's not his hand. Look at it more carefully. You'll see that the hand can't possibly bend it back like that. It would have to break right between the elbow and the wrist and then bend backwards holding that knife. And he's wearing a different colored sleeve. That is to symbolize Stephen, who was executed, the 13th disciple. So there's 13 men in that painting plus the woman and Jesus. Jesus is one of the 13. So the reason that I created all this research was I believe that the moon was piloted, since it's artificial, and it was used during the galactic invasion when Earth was attacked back about 12,000 years ago. All the evidence points to that happening because of the tilt of the planet, of the Earth, the fact that we only have about 12,000 years of erosion on the planet, and the lunar dust that they found on the moon was only about 12,000 years of accumulation of the dust that we have in our solar system. There's a lot of evidence they didn't go to the moon. That evidence is accurate. They filmed a lot of stuff here on Earth, but if they were faking the moonshots, why would they put, let's say, a layer of talcum powder over everything that was a quarter-inch deep, exactly what they found on the moon, 12,000 years of this stuff? Anyway, what's happening right now, the energy that the Earth is getting hit with, the waves of changes in weather that we're seeing, and the collapse of our electromagnetic field, and the poles starting to move much faster towards each other. The South Pole has left Antarctica. It is not on the continent of Antarctica. It is in the ocean and heading north toward the North Pole, which is heading, it's heading toward the South Pole. It's still kind of heading north in a way, but it's going up over the planet. All these changes are due to great cycles that are all culminating now, part of it having to do with this wave of energy coming in. That wave of energy is part of a gigantic cycle of years, anywhere between 25,000 and 26,000 years. It's a great day. It's a sun that lights up in its day period, like ours is 24 hours. This day period is 25,000 years, roughly.
I haven't interrupted you like all show except for the Saturn moon thing, but you did mention something about Sheldon Moore in your message to me about maybe the Pioneer things and filming something about like the second sun and all, but you're mentioning all this stuff about the second star and the many precession time period of 26,000 years. Do you think maybe Sheldon Moore is onto something with his, because I didn't mention that at the beginning, but he really got me intrigued with my recent interview I did with him, that there could be, God knows how many stars there are around the sun that we know, but when it comes to like a true binary star, I think he's onto something there. In regards to
I do too. Remember, I gave you that information about that particular encyclopedia. Were you able to forward that to him?
No, I was not, but I will do that now. That I will.
Yeah, he can find it at a major university. The one here in San Antonio is UTSA, and I was on a show with Rex on Leak Project, and he was not convinced. And I said, "Well, you're here in San Antonio. I'll take you to UTSA, and we can go up there on the second floor and pull Book 18 out, and you can look at it and tell me what the heck they're talking about." Yeah. But he never did. So, basically, it's a combination of events, and they're calling it the event. A lot of people are speaking about seeing dreams of this wave of light that comes in, and it's not going to be something you're going to ask, oh, was that it? You will be knocked down, from what I understand, the impact of this pressure that's moving in, and there will be a lot of casualties, as I understand it, but the energy will sort of literally transmute you into a sort of light body, but it's going to change a lot of things. And a lot of people who are incredibly evil, psychopathic type, when their bodies encounter this incredibly high energy, which would be like pure love, unconditional love, it's not a good outcome for them. It's just they will probably not survive it. According to all of the ancient texts, the writings, they basically say these people just drop dead. So that's kind of something that's sort of taking place, and the reason I'm mentioning this now is because it looks like, based on what we know, it'll probably happen before the end of the year. And this wave is not the final energetic blast that hits us, but it is a very powerful one that will be hitting us.
Oh,
and that's why.
Right there. I'm sorry don't mean to downplay what you're saying and all that, but when you give like exact dates and all, like say the end of the year, although it's kind of funny you mention that, it wasn't like maybe, I don't know, 5 or 6 months ago in one of the YouTube channels like Higher Self Event is Coming Soon that I usually only watch on weekends. They mentioned something about energy wave, a very significant energy wave culminating around winter solstice of this year. If only I knew exactly what that was, but I'm hearing you say this.
March, end of March, and people say, oh, nothing happened in March. Yeah, it did. I had a couple of friends that I called, and they were the energy was not affecting me the way it was affecting them, but they were basically in bed all day just praying to die from this energy. And once I worked on them and explained to them how to just let it go through you and go into the earth, kind of like a lightning rod, they were not affected by it anymore. But there's a lot of people being affected by these energy waves that are coming in. And an individual that I know that has clearance to high security stuff, he told me this would be 19 months. This would be a while back, a year and a half ago or so, but he said it was 19 months out, the wave that was approaching, and that would put it somewhere closer to the November timeframe of this year. And a lot of the people that we're talking to, and I really don't like giving dates. I don't even want to give this one out, but I'm not giving dates. I'm just saying it's September, October, November. But whatever happens, you're not going to be asking, oh, was that it? It's definitely something that's going to change a lot on the planet.
Yeah, yes, and of course, people say, well, if that's the case, then you ain't seen nothing yet in the time after that. So that's going to be very significant. And I'm very impressed with the way you can connect all these dots and find these things. This is a time when our intuition is supposed to get heightened, and your intuition, I'm assuming, is guiding you on all this stuff. And if it is, then, well, keep up the good work. A lot of people that are skeptical of like Jesus and what he was and what he wasn't and all that are gonna like throw red flags at this, but I don't want to do that. I don't think that was appropriate for me to do that in an interview like this. Better for me to just shut up and let you talk. And well, it was great having you on. I'm gonna have to bring the show to an end now. I kind of get to bed early to get up early, but
Okay. I wanted to mention something.
Go ahead. One last thing.
On the Acolyte's Quill, there is a button there that will take you to Amazon Prime. And if you sign up for Amazon Prime, you get 30 days free. And make sure you stop if you don't want to stay with Amazon Prime. But Amazon Prime allows you to read a lot of their ebooks that they have in this special collection. And mine is one of them. So you could read it for free in the next 30 days and then just cancel your Amazon Prime. And anyway, it's called Incredulous, and there's another book I wrote called Twilight's Last Gleaming. That's only about 18 pages long. That sells for 99 cents, but you can read it for free under that. And it's a summary of all my research. It covers both books, the approaching shock wave and the all the possible catastrophes that should have happened already and have not.
Thank you for getting it out. People are free to look at that and do their own research. So it was a pleasure having you on for this this brief show. Learned a few things myself. Really opened my eyes up to what Jesus is, what he isn't, and I think you're onto something, because this does seem to resonate with some of the other things I've heard people say about the life story of him and how it ties into some of this other stuff, Planet X and whatnot. And so great having you on. Keep sending me those links that you like to send me on Facebook. I do check them out. They're you always make me think with those things. And well, I guess best thing to say to you, namaste. Enjoy the last couple days of Mercury retrograde. Maybe that's why you lost track of the time and all before the show. And well, don't worry, it's going to come to an end on the new moon day in Aries, in my sign, this Sunday. So fresh start for all of us, I guess.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me on your show again.
Pleasure. All right, take care, Joe.